the world's most ethical companies. The Ethisphere Institute is a global leader in defining and advancing the standards of ethical business practice. They publish yearly a list of the most ethical companies. The Hartford and Arthur J. Gallagher were their 2014 insurance industry recipients. Stephen Lenson, publisher and editor-in-chief, spoke to the New York chapter at our annual ethics luncheon. His talk is about 16 minutes, and it's followed by a 6-minute Q&A. My name is John DiForte, and I am the ethics chair for the New York chapter, and I hope you enjoy this video.
So I'm with a company called Ethisphere, as was mentioned, and we're a relatively young company, and that's sort of the key word. We're about 9 years old. Our motto is good, smart, business, profit. And so what that means is we want companies to be wildly successful and make a bunch of money through ethics. So we want them to use ethics as a competitive advantage to differentiate in the marketplace and so on, and we help them do that. So we do that through a number of different platforms. We've got a publication that's been around for about 8 years now. It's a quarterly publication of the Institute. We'll always engage with different leaders of companies. So CEOs will always contribute, board members will always contribute, general counsel will always contribute. And then we'll try to get different roles within big companies too. The objective of which is really create a conversation within an organization, both internally and externally. So, if you have the ethics office or you have the compliance office, which I'm sure all of you have had interaction with at some point saying something, that may not be as effective as if you've got the CEO saying the same thing, or you've got a middle manager or a direct supervisor of everybody's daily role saying that kind of thing. So we work with these companies to really engage them on a enterprise-wide level. So we have the magazine. We have summits around the world. Our biggest was actually just in New York when Lou reached out to us, and that we have about 450 folks. What we're most known for is something called the World's Most Ethical Companies Award, and we've been issuing that for about 9 years. This year there are, I think, 132 recipient companies. Again, Arthur J. Gallagher is one of the insurance companies that was. We actually segment it into different industry lists. So if you look at all the different insurance industry categories, there's 11 insurance companies that are represented, from Aflac, which is one every year, to the Hartford, as we mentioned. I remember I think the second year we did this was 2008, and Hartford had just won for the second year. And there was some big football game going on between, I think, Notre Dame or USC, or some big nationally televised football game, and Hartford advertised that they had earned this recognition, and I got a bunch of phone calls from my friends saying, "Oh, you have a real job, you actually do something." And that was kind of a real moment for us to let us know this was serious. Since that time, I've got a slide with a bunch of quotes from leaders of recipient companies. So Jeff Immelt has been a guest editor of our magazine, the CEO of General Electric. Bill Ford has said we've worked with him on different levels. We've got some quotes from the CEO of US Bank and others. So it's really nice, again, to see these leaders at the top of these companies really care and buy into ethics and so on. And again, for the reasons I explained, which it makes it more integrated in the culture. So, one of the reasons Ethisphere was invited, and I was invited to speak here, is talk through our framework for how do we select these companies. And I think maybe there's 25 or so people in this room. If you asked all of you, how do you define ethics, you'd get 25 different answers. So that it's a really hard area to quantify and measure and so on, and that's something that we obviously aspire to do. So we've enlisted the help of a methodology advisory board, and the way that we define ethics, we solicit input from attorneys, from academics, from industry folks, from government regulators and so on, and reputation experts, and they'll all provide their input in their specialty area. So from that, we've come up with 5 categories that we reevaluate every year. We change the weightings every year. And from those categories, we develop a survey. So again, Arthur J. Gallagher is familiar with it. Some of you may have also applied, and you may be familiar with the survey, but it's about 115, 120 questions. It's a really comprehensive survey, followed up by verifying information. So we'll ask for evidence of programs or communications or whatever it is. So the 5 categories that we have right now are ethics and compliance program. And the history of that is when I started at Ethisphere about 9 years ago, when we just got off the ground, if you talk to any company and asked, okay, who owns ethics, it would be the compliance officer. It was strictly the compliance officer. And then you ask them, what do you do? What's your role? And they would say, we want to make sure we know what the Justice Department is looking for. If we get in trouble, we want to make sure we can answer their questions intelligently and so on. And what's amazing from the series of events that have happened over the past 9 years, whether it's the recession or some of the big scandals that happen in companies, is that world and the title of who owns ethics within a company has changed dramatically and quickly. And now if you ask a compliance person, or more frequently an ethics office, there's an actual ethics office, or you talk to a CEO or a country president or whatever it is, and you say, what do you do? What are your objectives? How do you define success? It's very much, we want to make sure our program is effective. So we've been talking about our values for 30 years. Maybe 30 years ago, people would roll their eyes at that and say, yeah, that's corporate speak. Now the goal is to really make that integrated into the company, make sure that all the employees from the top down understand what the values are and they live it and so on. So that's been an interesting change. So category 1 was ethics and compliance program. That's the largest section, and again, a little bit of background there. The second one is corporate citizenship and responsibility. So a lot of big companies have foundations. A lot of big companies have employee engagement programs where they'll work in the community or they'll volunteer. A lot of companies will have giving back programs. I know Target is one that caught our eye early, where they would give 5% of their revenue to philanthropic causes. And what was remarkable about that is a lot of companies would give a good percentage of their revenue to causes. Target did that in 2008 and 2009, 2007, when the recession was happening. They refused to reduce that number because they thought if that happened, it would be very easy for them to continue that reduced number. So that was an interesting program. Salesforce.com is another recipient of our award. They do something called the 111 program, and that's where they give 1% of their revenue to charity, 1% of their employee time is dedicated to philanthropic causes, and 1% of their product is donated as well. So again, that's kind of an interesting program that companies do. The third category is culture of ethics. So this ties into what I mentioned the goal of ethics offices are today, is how do they make sure their programs are actually effective. So we'll do different surveys and we'll poll employees and we'll talk to different stakeholders, whether it's suppliers or what have you. And based on their feedback, we can get a sense of, okay, has this really resonated within the company? The fourth is governance. So obviously the board and the senior leadership of a company have a big role in setting the tone and the culture and so on. And there's a lot of best practices in governance. Do you separate the CEO from the chairman and so on and so forth? So that'd be the fourth category. And then the fifth category is one that we call, it's a unique one, it's called leadership, innovation, reputation. So is what you're doing working? When we poll, if we look at news reports, or again, if we look at third parties, will all the sort of ecosystem around your company, will they agree with what you're saying? Do they understand what you're saying? When they think of your company, do they think, okay, this is an ethical company, the experiences that they've had in sales and so on? That'd be the fifth category that we measure. So this year we had 132 recipients, 50 industries were represented, 15 honorees were recognized for the first time, 11 honorees were recognized for the first time, and 15 companies have been honored since the inception for 9 years. So 15 companies have put a lot of work into their program. They think very highly of it. Aflac, again, is one of those. I know, sort of a peripheral insurance company. And if you go to the Baltimore airport, if you open Fortune magazine or Wall Street Journal, you'll see a lot of ads with the Aflac duck holding the world's most ethical companies logo in its mouth, which is kind of funny. And they've participated, their CEO and their communications folks and their GCs have participated in our activities. And very often they'll bring some little plush ducks with them too. So most of the people involved you'll be hearing Aflac throughout the event. Another kind of cool thing is this year we had 10.1 million Twitter impressions. So as a company, again, we're a company that we want to be successful through making other companies successful through ethics. So we're a B2B company. We don't get the kinds of traffic that let's say a New York Times or what have you. But when we announce this thing, to show how much interest ethics is in all the stakeholders of companies, we had 10.1 million Twitter impressions this year. We had more than 3 million unique hits to our website in a day after we announced this. And I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but millions of views through broadcast media and print media and so on over the course of the days when this is announced. So, it's become a really big deal. And going back to the companies that have earned this for 15 years, there's a lot of pressure on them to actually maintain this once they have it, because it's one thing to get it, and it's also an uncomfortable conversation to have with many different people if all of a sudden you don't get it. So, we applaud them that they've been able to earn that for so long. I have another chart here so talking about that, it's great that everyone looks at this. You get a lot of interest from stakeholders, from customers, what have you, but why does this really matter? So we have a graph that we publicize every year that tracks what we call the World's Most Ethical Companies Index. So that's the publicly traded companies that have earned WME. We index them together, and we track them against either the S&P or the FTSE or a lot of other leading indices. And every year the WME index has beat that. So even in 2008, when everything was going down, the WME index went down. It went down less. It also bounced back much more quickly. So again, I have this chart, and I'm happy to send it around if anyone wants to take a look. Now, is it causation? It's hard to say that it's causation, but is it correlation? Yeah, absolutely. So these companies that care about ethics, you read all the different studies tied to that. There's a very clear link behind financial performance and ethical behavior. And so, we hear feedback from a number of companies talking about how they'll give this presentation to their boards and in global town halls and all other sort of forums just to make this clear and get everybody to buy in on this idea of ethics. So that's always a really nice thing to hear. And then finally, why does it matter, particularly as it relates to the folks in this room, is because it builds trust. So, I'm sure all of you at some point have probably said what I'm about to say, or you've certainly heard what I'm about to say, but the insurance industry really it sells trust in a sense. So the product that you sell is assurance that when something goes wrong, you're going to be there for your client. You're going to pay the claims. You're going to make sure that if there's a death in the family or something happens in a property situation, you're going to be there to help them. Now, it's hard to sell trust. So what's nice about ethical behavior and some of the insurance companies who have earned this recognition is how they use it and how they communicate it, and it again leads to greater business performance, a differentiator for them and their peers, and so on. So I'm going to go very quickly through. I didn't dive into a lot of the studies. Many of you may have seen these, but there's a tremendous amount of studies out there that link different areas of trust to ethics. So some of those are things like increased employee engagement. So employees actually care. They like getting up and going to work every day when they know they work for an ethical company. There's greater customer retention. There's reduced instances of fraud. So that kind of doubles down on itself, where employees are also not committing fraud at your companies. Lower procurement costs is an interesting one. Improved recruiting. So there's a lot of companies that will use this recognition or other programs that they've done at job fairs at universities around the world and get better quality employees. There's obviously reduced legal risk, communications opportunities, and another way to, again, reinforce company values, which is really the important point of all of this. When you have tens of thousands of employees, so specific to this group, what can you do? What can companies do? What can individuals do, and so on? And again, I've got a couple examples here of what other companies have done that are relatively easy, regardless of the size. We'll work with everyone from the GEs of the world and Boeings to smaller local companies, whether they're local construction companies or insurance companies. And they'll always say, well, so-and-so has a great, GE has a great program. They measure everything. They build everything in-house, but they're also GE. They operate in 137 different countries. And so we'll have folks from GE, their Brackett Deniston, their general counsel, or again, Jeff Immelt, their CEO, or others, and they'll get asked that question. And they will always come back and say, we do have a lot of resources. Actually, if you ask them, they think they're short of resources too, like everybody else. I'm convinced nobody has enough resources in this world. But they'll give a bunch of examples of what companies can do just with time and commitment and so on. So some of those examples would be communicate successes. If you've done something well, talk about it. If you've had employee engagement programs, if you've gotten local chapters of your offices to go, work in the community, volunteer, talk about that. It's a good thing to talk about that. It shows all the other people in your company are now aware that happens. It reinforces what your company is committed to, and hopefully it encourages them to try to create those similar programs all around the world, or in the country, or wherever you're operating. And then the other thing, so both internally and externally, so absolutely talk about that with customers too. Again, it's all about making sure that your whole ecosystem knows your story, they know your values, they know what you're all about, and some companies will be shy or afraid of saying that, and they say, no, we don't want to put ourselves in that attention, but we would go back to them and say, it's worth the effort to do that. Now, on the flip side is talk about your lapses. Talk about when somebody does something wrong, when there was a problem. Often in our case, because we deal with a lot of lawyers and compliance officers, it has to do with DOJ investigations. One example is Best Buy. There was a compliance person from Best Buy, very well known in the compliance and ethics industry, and 9 years ago she had a blog that would terrify any lawyer. So you say she was just going to air everything that happened, and every lawyer said, you're nuts. And it was incredibly successful and helpful for Best Buy. So not only would she say the positive things, but if there was an issue that was elevated to her office, or there was, an employee was terminated in Best Buy, rumors start happening really quick. So what she would do is say, here's what happened, here's why the employee was terminated, here's how it violated our values or our culture, and here was the result. And one time in the extreme side of that, she actually told me about when she organized a town hall, a company-wide town hall, where an issue happened, rumors started spiraling out of control. She got somebody from the Justice Department, the prosecutor, to come in, got a number of the management from that store involved, and they talked about it to the entire company and said, here's what happened, and here's why it's important that Best Buy did what we did, and here's our expectations of you, and so on. And that kind of stuff is extremely valuable to building a culture. So ethics committees. Now, depending on the role of everyone in the room, you may or may not be organizing these ethics committees. There's generally certain titles who will spearhead those. But other best practices that we've seen is companies, and actually I think I was talking to Tom about this too at the other day in Arthur J. Gallagher, but the best companies are starting to organize diverse ethics committees. So it's not a bunch of lawyers who are writing up really hard to digest legal documents. There will be a lawyer, they'll also get a communicator, they'll get a middle manager, they'll get a salesperson, they'll get a whole range of different titles from different regions together to talk about issues. And they say, okay, what's happening? What do you think of this company? What should our expectations be? And again, that just creates champions across the organization, and it shows that this is really an ingrained system. So the final thing that I'm going to say is what are relatively new and we've seen become wildly successful are industry initiatives. So this is kind of an industry initiative. You may have heard of something called DII, which has been around for a while, the Defense Industry Initiative. And my understanding is that actually came about because there were some issues. There were some legal troubles in the defense industry. So they wanted to correct that, and they created this collection of leaders, the CEOs and other business side leaders of defense industries, to come together and talk about ethics. So they would share best practices, they would make sure they had a public commitment, they would learn what their peers were doing in terms of if somebody has a problem or complains, how do they make sure there's no retaliation, you're not firing somebody who's reporting wrongdoing and so on. And that was a successful group. So I would encourage, whether it's through this group or whether it's through individual networking among the members here, I'm not aware of anything in the insurance industry that's like that. So there may be small groups and so on, but that's a real opportunity to get people together and say, okay, here are the risks in the insurance industry. Here are the problems. Here are some of the stereotypes of maybe why we're unsuccessful in selling to clients and so on. And how can we use ethics as a way to improve that situation? So that would be a big one there. So with that, that's a very fast overview of the world's most ethical companies, sort of why it matters, and some of the examples companies are doing. And are there any questions I can answer? So the question was, Ethisphere and the companies that we work with are global in nature. And so if you work in Asia or Latin America or wherever it is, you're going to have different cultural expectations, which would maybe be contradictory ethical values and so on. And yeah, we get that all the time. And it really is it's fascinating. So I remember one of the first times we addressed that is in our magazine, actually. We had an article written by a professor who pointed out in certain Asian cultures, what we would call nepotism is considered a fishing business. So, family members know you have to be respectful to people outside of family members. And family members also know the strengths and weaknesses of their family members. So they feel that it's appropriate in certain instances to put family members in different positions. And again, here that'd probably be, it's not a cultural norm of ours. So that's one example. The other, we just did something in Europe, and what's interesting is a big piece of US culture building and ethics is hotline reports and non-retaliation. So everybody's experienced something wrong. Even the companies that are on this list, again, the survey is exhaustive. GE, for example, again, 130 some countries, they've all had problems. They all have issues going on. They all have employees who have done something wrong, and they have to address that. And so what we look at is how they address it and so on. So a big piece of that is, are there plenty of opportunities for anonymous hotline reports? So if you're a shipping company and you have employees on a boat in the middle of the ocean and they see something, how can they do that? Or if you're a Starbucks and you've got employees at a restaurant, how can you do that? Or you're a corporate setting and everybody's corporate, do they have the proper mechanisms to do that? Now in Europe, there's still some legacy in Eastern Europe about World War II and so on. And so there was one company in particular who was talking about, in Poland, they're very suspect of hotline reports because some of them even grew up in a culture where you can't do that. And so these companies had to over-communicate to them about the value of doing this, what comes from that, how there is no retaliation, and so on. And so you absolutely get that in different places, and it's a fascinating challenge, really. That's a good question. So the question was, how many insurance companies participate in the survey, and if you don't earn the award, does that mean you're not ethical? So your first question's tricky, and we actually don't answer that because of your second question. So we have to be very sensitive to whenever we say we're advocating for ethics or sort of the arbiter of ethical behavior, whatever it is, there's a lot of sensitivity to that because it's a big deal to apply to this recognition. Whether it's a communications person or an ethics person or a lawyer, whatever it is, they tend to have to build a little bit of a coalition across functions to get all the responses. And so they've sort of put themselves out there saying, hey, let's do this. And then if they don't get the recognition, that doesn't go well. And so we don't want to then just pile on and say these companies applied and didn't get it. It's a really sensitive thing. So have insurance companies applied that haven't earned it? Yeah, they have. Your specific company, I don't know. I wouldn't say, I would say that if a company applies and doesn't get it, that doesn't mean they're not focused on ethics or they don't have good culture or so on. There's also different situations where, going back to the nature of the size of these companies, you can have a particularly high-risk, heavily regulated industry that has really good elements in one regard and all of a sudden paid a $2 billion fine in another thing because there's another area that's so. We learn very on if you go out there and just attack companies or you write about what's going wrong, that doesn't affect positive change. They just want to sue you. And I spent some time at CNN before this, which was very sensational. And so it was interesting coming to this where you kind of have this sensational mentality and you learn that's not effective at all. So we try to highlight even those companies that are big and diverse and have a problem on one arm. If they're doing something else well, we want to talk about that because we want others in their industry to do that piece. We don't want them to do the thing that got them fined, obviously.
So when a company applies and they don't get it, do you respond to show them what areas they were deficient in?
Yeah. So the question is, if a company applies and doesn't get it, do we respond and show them what areas they're deficient in? So companies that apply, every company that applies gets a scorecard. So we have a bunch of data from these applicant companies, and we won't say how they've performed relative to their industry peers, but we'll anonymize it and we'll say, here's how you scored relative to other applicants and so on. So then they can do what they need to.
Yeah, you also do things wrong, but as you said before, it's how you deal with it. If you remember, Aflac had a spokesman. The duck was Gilbert Gottfried, and Gilbert Gottfried said some stuff and did some stuff that was really stupid, and they fired him immediately. They went on TV saying they fired him, and the newspapers saying they fired him, and then they got the award year after year because that's how they deal with bad eggs, so to speak.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly, and that was yeah. And we have many examples of that too in other industries that were less high profile, but it is how they respond. Then there's some companies that will apply and not tell us they're about to get some sort of big, and they won't get it, and they probably shouldn't apply again. Yes.
So how do you get a company to go from not thinking about the importance of ethics to apply and to get them on the road to becoming ethical?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was, how do you get a company to focus on ethics, which is not interested in applying for the award, right? Was it?
Well, it could eventually lead to that.
Eventually lead to that. So it's a very good question, and it's a common one. There's actually some companies in these rooms. I've talked to folks who said, yeah, we don't want to put that target on our back, is how they phrase it. Because if you stand up and say you're an ethical company, very likely you're going to get more scrutiny. And so some of the examples that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the intent of that was to show how you don't have to apply for an award or you don't have to get third-party recognition, and there's still programs that you can do. So we would probably tell them, now there are companies that specialize in, they actually have paid services that would go help those companies do that, and we don't. But we would give them pointers from what we've seen and from different applicant companies. So we would say things like, get your employees engaged. Here's examples of programs that companies have that might be interesting. Linking the ethics and the communications department up is critical, especially because historically the ethics department has been a bunch of lawyers, as I mentioned, and they hopefully will admit they're terrible communicators. And linking them up with communications people helps create documents and other materials that are actually read by the employee base. So we would give them those sorts of steps. And we also have a lot of examples of what companies do when they have received the recognition. So a lot of them they'll have internal town halls, or they'll put it in their email signature, or we've had some financial groups that in quarterly earnings calls, they'll talk about it, or it's in SEC filing. It's in a wide range of things. So we can give them guidance based on that, and then they can use their judgment on. Yep, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.